Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first event in this segment of Formations, which is dedicated to representations of breastfeeding in literature, art, and research worldwide. I'm Jenny Ramon, and I run Formations as part of Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre activities in collaboration with the Bonington Gallery. This segment is titled Milk and begins with a conversation which explores the boundaries between the personal, the professional, and the creative when undertaking and talking about breastfeeding in artistic and academic work. After my introduction of tonight's three special guest speakers, each guest will, in turn, offer a brief presentation of about 10 minutes in length each about their work and the representation of breastfeeding in their work. After that, we'll think about whether research on breastfeeding elicits more personal disclosure than other kinds of research. We'll discuss each other's work, and I will pose questions about reactions and responses to their work, as well about their aims and motivations for representing breastfeeding. After that, there'll be time for audience questions. So if you would like to ask any of the guests a question, please either email it to me at formations@ntu.ac.uk or write it in the chat on YouTube. I'll try to find time to answer as many of the questions as I can. Tonight's event will be about an hour long, and we're delighted that you can join us for this conversation. This event marks the beginning of a new research project for me, and I look forward to further events that help to make breastfeeding stories more visible while recognising their complexity and the ways in which they differ across the globe. My own experience was that I had a very easy pregnancy and then a serious bleed at 30 weeks, which luckily did not have any impact beyond knocking my own confidence and making me much slower for the rest of the pregnancy. I was determined to breastfeed, and luckily that too was easy for me, so easy that it lasted 3.5 years. I was very confident breastfeeding in public, at restaurants, standing in the street, walking around, anywhere, and I was never challenged. I did feel that I was being judged to an extent because of that, though, what would be considered extended breastfeeding in the UK, but ordinary in many other places. And this was perhaps because even at 4 months, other mothers started to insist that their babies had needed to wean, as though this was common practice and anything other than starting weaning at 4 months was inappropriate. A health visitor also suggested that I start baby-led weaning at 6 months. I dutifully attempted both with baby rice and then with sweet potato, and rapidly gave up after my daughter was very unhappy with the idea and turned to my diary in rage to record my problems with doing this. My daughter stopped breastfeeding gradually and was a little disappointed when she asked for milk after a 2-week break, and I said it had all gone. Every breastfeeding story is likely to be as particular as this one, and one aim of my wider breastfeeding project is to reject the idea of a norm. And rejecting the idea of a norm is also something that many breastfeeding and motherhood activists and support groups, especially those that you can find on social media, are also doing, often questioning the word should and all the distress that that word can bring. But at the same time, my project is actually a comparative analysis of representations of breastfeeding in literary texts and in visual art. So I sometimes wonder why I feel compelled to share my personal experiences in this way, but I do feel the need to. So tonight we'll think about this question and consider where the personal intersects with the creative or with the academic, and in response to Dionne Irving Bremyer's work, which is both creative and academic, where the personal intersects with both the creative and the academic. It's time to introduce tonight's three special guests then. Anne-Marie Short is the first speaker tonight. Anne-Marie Short is Associate Professor in English, Gender and Women's Studies at St Mary's College in Indiana. Her research interests include post-colonial studies, motherhood studies, and US immigrant literature. In 2018, she co-edited the only recent edited collection focusing on breastfeeding in literature and culture, and one of the only texts looking at breastfeeding from a literary or cultural perspective, Breastfeeding and Culture, Discourses and Representation, which was published by Demeter Press, a specialist motherhood studies press. She wrote an essay for the same volume on extended breastfeeding in Emma Donoghue's Room, which dwelt on the representation of and reader and critical responses to breastfeeding in the novel. This evening, Anne-Marie will discuss this interdisciplinary collection of essays and talk about her experience of editing a collection of work that took on the subject of breastfeeding from so many different perspectives. Anne-Marie will be followed by Dionne Irving Bremyer. Originally from Toronto, Dionne's work has appeared in Boulevard Magazine, Lit Hub, Missouri Review, Story Magazine, and New Delta Review, among others. She has a novel, Quint, forthcoming from 713 Books in August this year, and a short story collection, Islands, forthcoming from Catapult in 2022. In this event, Dionne's presentation will include excerpts from My Black Breast Friend, Breastfeeding and My Black Body, an essay which was first published in Anne-Marie Short's edited collection. The essay makes connections between the author's experience breastfeeding her child and the historical and cultural issues surrounding Black women breastfeeding their babies. Dionne's presentation will link the contemporary experience of breastfeeding as a Black mother to historical trauma and to low infant mortality among Black children. Dionne will be followed by Lynn Lu. Lynn Lu is a visual artist from Singapore. Trained in the US, France, and Japan, she earned her Doctor of Philosophy in Fine Art at the University of Newcastle in Australia. Her multidisciplinary practice revolves around participation and collaboration, context and site specificity, and the poetics of absurdity. Since 1997, Lynn has exhibited and performed extensively worldwide. Recent venues include some of the most prestigious galleries in the world, in multiple locations, including in Singapore, Germany, the UK, China, and Australia. Lynn lives and works between Singapore and London. She's a visiting artist at London College of Communication, University of the Arts London, Associate Lecturer at Nanyang Academy of Fine Arts, and Associate Artist at Performance Space. In this event, Lynn will present 4 works made with her lactating breasts, and through these works discuss maternal time that can only go at the pace of the other, bearing witness to a maternal experience that doesn't fit with the popular narrative, the rich folklore surrounding lactation, and the magical qualities attributed to breast milk. Each speaker will now give about a 10-minute presentation before we all come back together for a conversation. Remember to send any questions at any point throughout the event. I'm now delighted to welcome Anne-Marie Short, followed by Dionne Irving Bremyer, and then Lynn Lu. Welcome, Anne-Marie, and thank you very much for being here this evening.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful introduction, and to you and all the organizers for inviting me to participate in this event. I have to say, listening to your introduction made me think that I've sort of come full circle with all of this, because when I first conceived of my project with Room, it was 9 years ago, and I was breastfeeding a 2.5-year-old who's now 11. And when the book was published, I just found out that I was pregnant with my now 2.5-year-old. And she is still breastfeeding, and I'm now in the process of weaning her because I've had my second shot. And I feel that I'm giving her the antibodies that she needs to feel comfortable to wean. And so it feels like, in some ways, closing a chapter on this both personal and professional life-giving project. As Dr. Ramon said, I'm going to be reading from the introduction of this collection of essays that I co-edited called Breastfeeding and Culture, Discourses and Representation, and then I'll speak a little bit more informally. In May 2012, when Time magazine featured a mother breastfeeding her 3-year-old son on its cover, I had just secured my first tenure track job and was still nursing my 2-year-old daughter between teaching at various institutions and preparing for a cross-country move. Given my personal and professional interests in mothering discourse, I pored over the commentary that proliferated online in the weeks and months that followed. As the mother of a nursing toddler, I cringed defensively at the disgust, rage, and accusations of sexual abuse directed at Jamie Lynn Grummet, the 26-year-old mother featured on the Time cover. As a feminist, I understood with as much intellectual objectivity as I could muster that at the heart of these reactions were deeply held cultural anxieties about the female body and the underlying tension between maternal and sexualized interpretations of its functions. Still, I chafed at the provocative question, posed in all caps, the final two words emphasized in red font in the middle of the page. Are you mom enough? Why, I wonder, did the editor have to go there? The answer probably has more to do with the bottom line than ideology, but the question was clearly meant to hit a nerve, and it most definitely did. Although the article accompanying the photo was about attachment parenting and the ensuing debates were by and large focused on issues related to breastfeeding, is breast best? How old is too old to nurse? Is it okay to nurse in public, covered or uncovered? Various iterations of these questions swirled around the comment sections of news sites, throughout the parenting blogosphere, and on social media, and the emotional intensity of these conversations suggested that they were long overdue. Moreover, in the provocative question it poses, the Time magazine cover engages with a decidedly unfeminist debate over what makes a so-called good mother. The question, are you mom enough, though ostensibly addressing the demands of attachment parenting, is easily applicable to the countless other ways in which mothering has become competitive and divisive. It is more important than ever for motherhood scholars and activists to remember that the terms of these debates have emerged out of patriarchal structures and have been shaped by patriarchal values. In that spirit, contributors throughout this collection cite Linda Bloom, Bernice Hausman, Joan Wolfe, as well as other scholars, all of whom have worked to dismantle damaging discourses tying maternal value to specific mothering practices, such as breastfeeding and attachment parenting. The past 2 decades have brought these conversations into the public arena in unprecedented ways, thanks to digital connectivity and social media. In some ways, online manifestations of this discourse have intensified its divisiveness. Take, for instance, the way the Fed is Best campaign, which began in response to messaging from the World Health Organization and the March of Dimes promotion of breastfeeding as the best way to feed babies. It turned into a hashtag war. In other ways, the digital age has encouraged solidarity and has allowed mothers to find support from online communities and message boards, seemingly innumerable Facebook groups, and ever-popular mommy blogs, and now Instagram feeds. These virtual communities exist for countless parenting niches, which, among many other things, reflect a wide variety of infant feeding situations. Breastfeeding activists, or lactivists as they have come to be called, also use online spaces to organize nurse-ins, which have become an increasingly popular way to shame establishments such as restaurants that ask breastfeeding mothers to leave or cover up. Unsurprisingly, then, several chapters in this collection speak to the role that the internet and social media play in facilitating contemporary parenting culture. Although online spaces have the potential to become echo chambers for the like-minded and are still overwhelmingly cis and heteronormative, the internet shows no sign of receding as a force that both disseminates and shapes breastfeeding discourse. The collection attends to diffuse discourses and cultural representations of infant feeding and interrogates, using feminist methodologies, essentializing ideologies suggesting that women's bodies are the natural choice for infant feeding. These interdisciplinary and methodologically diverse analyses, which include history, law, art history, literary studies, sociology, critical race studies, media studies, communication studies, are meant to represent a broader conversation about how society understands infant feeding and maternal autonomy. In particular, our goal as editors is to facilitate deeper and more complex discussions about how natural as a construct informs breastfeeding discourse and representation at a moment when there is much interest in and concern about how babies are fed. The authors in this collection are interested in engaging with the construction of natural as it continues to be employed in breastfeeding discourse. Questions about what is natural about breastfeeding get articulated implicitly and explicitly in a wide range of cultural spaces. And the ubiquity of these discussions reveals the countless ways in which women's bodies continue to be the subject to moralizing public scrutiny. Feminists know all too well how problematic natural can be when employed to connote normative gendered or sexual behavior, particularly when that behavior is connected to biological sex or reproduction. Breastfeeding, and indeed the institution of motherhood, are all too often attached to the oppressive dictum of biology as destiny. And the essays in this collection explore the varied ways in which this tension makes itself felt in how breastfeeding is represented and discussed in contemporary culture. Breastfeeding raises many important concerns surrounding gendered embodiment, reproductive rights and autonomy, essentializing discourses, and public policies that undermine parents, especially mothers. Although many experts have written about breastfeeding since the publication of that notorious Time magazine cover, further need for feminist, academic, activist work in addressing the complexity of contemporary breastfeeding discourse remains. This collection responds to that need, and the essays within it engage with the varied and complicated ways in which cultural attitudes about mothering and female sexuality inform how people understand, embrace, reject, and talk about breastfeeding, as well as with the promises and limitations of feminist breastfeeding advocacy. So I'll stop here and talk a little bit less formally about the collection's contents, including my own chapter. And you'll be hearing from Dionne next, and she is a co-editor and contributor. We also worked with Dr. Abigail Palco, who is the director of the Women's Center at the University of Virginia, a scholar who's done a lot of work in the area of motherhood studies. It's very important to me that the book be interdisciplinary and include research on a variety of cultural contexts. And I think that there is room in future work to be even more interdisciplinary and include even more diverse ways of thinking about breastfeeding and gender identity. So it does include scholars from the variety of fields that I listed, and also includes 2 chapters focused on India and 2 chapters focused on Ireland, breastfeeding in those contexts. In my own chapter, which is titled "In This Whole Story, That's the Shocking Detail, Extended Breastfeeding in Emma Donohue's Novel Room," I try to unpack the various connotations of the word natural when it comes to breastfeeding. So in that novel, a young woman who has been kidnapped, sexually assaulted, and kept in captivity for years is still breastfeeding the 5-year-old child that she is raising in this dungeon-like room where they're being kept. So I use anthropological research on extended breastfeeding, and I pair that with a close look at a variety of negative responses that readers had to the breastfeeding in the novel. And I coded language from Goodreads book reviews and Amazon.com book reviews to do that. And I use that to think through these questions about what is and isn't natural, both about the breastfeeding in the novel, which takes place under these really horrific circumstances, and also about the reading public's aversion to reading about that in print. The other thing that was really important for me to think about with this book is, and something that for me shifted while I was working on it, is I didn't want it to take an ideological position about whether breastfeeding is best, right? And so even though for me, I originally conceived of the project as a way to channel this deep investment that I had in supporting breastfeeding mothers, channeling it into my academic work, I felt like during the process, I moved away from that a little bit because so much of what I was seeing from academic mothers that were contributing spoke to the harm that breastfeeding advocacy can actually do when framed in a particular way. So ultimately, what I continue to be most interested in with respect to how breastfeeding is talked about and represented is how it's used to moralize about particular kinds of mothering, and of course, the perennial issue of lack of support for mothers in whatever choice that they make, and support for caregivers sort of across the board. I will stop there.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'm so happy to be here and be engaged in this conversation. And thank you so much to Dr. Ramon for organizing this panel. It's such an important topic, I think, to talk about. So I'm just going to read an excerpt from my essay, my Black breast friend. I want to say best friend every time I say that, but breast doesn't roll off the tongue, I guess, as quickly and easily. So I'll just get started. Absolutely nothing is fine about my birth experience. I cannot even hold my baby for the first few hours of his life, my arms still heavy and deadened from the anesthesia. Finally, my head still dense with the fog of medical sleep. I managed to cradle this new life. I undo my hospital gown in order to feed him for the first time, to reconcile my body to his. But his mouth is limp. He won't latch with his exquisite little duck mouth, the one we talked and laughed and smiled about during our childbirth classes. There is no connection between his being and mine. He doesn't suckle. I snap shut my sturdy black nursing bra after trying in vain to feed my son, after failing to do what may well be the most natural thing a mother can do. And then, click, the clasp against my clavicle, and just like that, I'm brought back to the rosebud clasp on my training bra, holding my tiny, budding breasts. The click of this bra seems to tell me the same thing. My breasts have failed me again. I've fallen short of even the most pathetic, of most easy apparent parental aspirations. The trauma surrounding his birth has left him lethargic. His head and body are floppy. His mouth is limp and won't grip the nipple when I push it into his mouth again and then again. He doesn't suck. He doesn't latch. He just lets it lie there. In comes the lactation consultant, a gaggle of nurses, various contraptions, bottles, a series of confusions. My breasts feel empty. Where's my milk? We're going to have to give him formula, says one of the nurses. He must eat. I feel panic surging through my body. This is what I hear. You cannot care for your baby. I want to breastfeed, I tell the nurse. I don't want him to get nipple confusion. She leaves the room and comes back with a plastic spoon. You can feed him off of this, she says. Still not eating, the lactation consultant says when she comes back later in the day. I've not yet stood up or used the bathroom. My legs are cocooned within giant blood pressure cuffs to maintain circulation after my emergency C-section. Where is my milk? I ask. The lactation consultant shrugs and takes my baby out of my hands. If he doesn't start eating soon, they'll have to put him in the NICU. The nurse feeds my son Similac off the plastic spoon, which he finally starts to sip. Later, I hand express colostrum onto the same plastic spoon that my husband holds against my nipple, and I cry softly. And I think maybe I waited too long. I click the clasp closed to restrain the breasts I had tried to contain for years, and which now seem to have a mind of their own. They sense my son's need, and begin to expand. They leak, they flow, and they ache, and still, my baby won't latch. Slaves were expected to wean their babies when they were between 8 and 12 months old. Slaveholders enforced this practice by gradually limiting the amount of time that slave mothers were allowed to feed their infants. By the time infants were walking, breastfeeding during the day was prohibited. Slaves who were caught breastfeeding exposed themselves to potential punishments as bad as can be imagined. One slave, Peggy Perry, devastated that she was unable to adequately nurse her baby in the 15 minutes she was allotted by the overseer, prayed to God, quote, that the infant would soon die and end her misery as well as his. Such a prayer must have been common. There's a growing body of scientific study that shows that we can inherit fear from our ancestors. It can create biases and fall under the category of what psychotherapist Carl Jung defined as the collective unconscious, and what other scientists describe as genetic memory. A 2013 study at Emory University School of Medicine showed that trauma could affect DNA and alter the brains and behaviors of subsequent generations. We are only 150 years removed from the nearly 250-year institution of slavery in America. If the science is true, is it feasible that Black mothers who prayed for the death of their infants might have, in effect, hardwired into their own descendants a hesitation in relation to their own children? Children who, as recently as 150 years ago, were not only liable to be removed from their mother's breasts, but to be beaten, raped, or wrenched away from their family at any time. Consider this poem that makes the rounds during Black Breastfeeding Week by Hess Love. I wish I dried up. I wish every drop of milk slipped past those pink lips and nourished the ground where the bones lay of my babies, starved while I feed their murderer. I wish I dried up so the Mrs. Babies would dry up too and be brittle, so I could crumble them to dust, return them to the ground where all children of my bosom lay equal. According to the Centers for Disease Control, Black women are less likely to begin and to continue breastfeeding their children more than any other group of mothers. And although the rate at which Black mothers choose the bottle over the breast has declined in recent years, Black mothers still have the lowest prevalence of breastfeeding initiation and duration among all groups of women. According to the CDC, although U.S. breastfeeding rates are increasing, rates remain relatively low among some groups of women, particularly those who are young, Black, or at or below the federal poverty level and have less than a college education. The Black women whom the CDC describes aren't like me at all. I recall a fragment of a yoga class years ago and tell myself that I am an island and leave myself open to whatever the universe intends for me. But before I give birth, I'm hopeful that my baby will take the breast. But if I cannot breastfeed, I will simply give my baby formula and everything will be fine. This is the lie I tell myself when I whisper fine in conversation or under my breath, when I repeat it in my head over and over again, a mantra bending the future to my will. I understand that come hell or high water, I will breastfeed. At the Breast, Ideologies of Breastfeeding and Motherhood in the Contemporary United States by sociologist Linda Bloom, several Black mothers consider the attachment that breastfeeding creates between them and their child. In their discussion with the author, they are ambivalent about the desire for that kind of closeness. Andrea Bronson, a young Black mother, describes the process this way. When they breastfeed, they get attached. I don't want that hassle, especially with me going back to work. I want my babies to be attached, but not that attached. According to Bronson, the benefits of breastfeeding don't outweigh her concerns. She explains, the doctor said breast milk was the best, but I told them I didn't want to. They tried to talk me into it, but they couldn't. They gave me a videotape and papers, but I didn't want to breastfeed. It is difficult to imagine that with the lingering specter of a child being whisked away, that a mother would listen to any authority figure who encouraged attachment. No less than 2 hours after we are home from the hospital, my milk comes in, and like a kind of miracle, the baby latches almost immediately. I weep with relief. He is eating. My joy barely lasts a week before I, chilled, feverish, and exhausted, realize that something isn't right. I'm still recovering from the birth, but I know something is wrong. The doctor diagnoses me with mastitis. A bacterium from my son's mouth has infected my breasts. Keep breastfeeding if you can, my gynecologist says, but it's okay if you stop. The mastitis causes me to feel like hot crushed glass is coming through my nipples. My breasts feel like they are being ripped apart and then devoured by my son's hungry mouth and incessant need. I cry each time I breastfeed, which is upwards of 12 times a day. I try not to scream to scare the boy. I kick my coffee table so hard I am worried that I break a toe. It's okay to use formula if you need to. My friends who are mothers write and text to tell me this. My pediatrician, my gynecologist, and my own mother all tell me the same thing. Logically, I know they are right. But in my head, I keep going over the idea that if I can't feed my child, what else am I good for? During his first pediatrician's visit, my son is underweight and he is hungry. The pediatrician suggests waking him up every 2 hours to feed him, day or night. My husband sets alarms, and like zombies, we wake up, and then we wake up the baby. Once awake, he screams and resists or screams, and then my husband's white hands force our baby onto my Black breast. Around the end of the second month, my son, like magic, turns a corner. He begins to latch on his own. He reaches for my breasts independently. He takes the skin on the underside of my breast and curls it around his fist as if to intensify our closeness. He gazes up at me, studying my face, barely blinking as if considering this woman who is his mother. And I feel so acutely aware of the paradox of motherhood. That if I do the best I can for him, someday he will grow up and old and away from me. He may someday think it is weird that I breastfed him so long. He probably won't want to talk about it and won't remember these moments we had together, figuring out the beginnings of our relationship. Thank you.
Wow, that was so amazing, Dionne. And I feel like I share so many of your experiences. I guess we'll talk about that a little bit later. So thank you so much, Dr. Ramon, for inviting me to be part of this discussion. I'm really happy to be here. My name is Lynn Lu. I'm a visual artist based in Singapore and London. As Jenny mentioned, I will be presenting 4 works with my lactating breasts, and through these works discuss maternal time that can only go at the pace of the other. Josh, am I able to see what slides you have on the screen? No? No, I won't be able to see it. Okay. All right. Maternal time that can only go at the pace of the other, bearing witness to a maternal experience that doesn't fit with the popular narrative and the rich folklore surrounding lactation and the magical qualities attributed to breast milk. And I should begin this with a preface. Nothing about the experience of birthing or milk making came intuitively or naturally to me, despite having a female body that's evolved to do just that. In fact, jumping out of airplanes at 15,000 feet for fun in my youth has felt more intuitive to me than motherhood. My nipples had to be mauled to the point of bleeding in order to extract the volume of milk my baby needed. I have very small breasts and that held a tiny volume. Hence, I had to pump every 3 hours through the night and day for 30 minutes each time. We never succeeded in latching correctly, even with multiple lactation consultants hired at great cost. So that's 8 pumping sessions a day and 4 hours in total, immobilized by the breast pumps, not counting the time taken to clean and sterilize the bottles, etc. So this was tricky with my performance schedules, so I decided to use my lactating breasts as my main performance prop for the first year of my child's life. The first work I'll present is entitled Adagio. Adagio is a triptych, a suspended block of ice with a blossoming native Australian flower. Frozen in it slowly melts. A baby plays with her toes. A woman is hooked up to breast pumps. A steady trickle of milk pools at her feet. My baby was 5 months old then, and I was reeling from having lost all control of my own time. I was adjusting to a new life in which it now took several days to complete a simple task like responding to an email. Adjusting to life moving at this painfully glacial pace. The psychologist Lisa Baretza talked about maternal time and the time of care generally, or time that can only go at the pace of the other, and that we tend to associate with female time. And the sociologist Anne Karp wrote of the new mother becoming instantly interruptible. She must put aside the threads of her personal existence and attend to the child. Now, the next 3 works I'll be showing, which none of you can see, were made on a 2-week performance tour in 5 cities in Canada. The original plan was to bring my child, Kiki, along to perform with me, but she proved to be an uncooperative prop in Australia. So I left her in London with her dad and a freezer full of breast milk. As you know, lactation operates on demand and supply. So in order to maintain my milk production, I had to continue emptying my breasts on this grueling schedule. This work, entitled On Mother's Milk and Kisses Fed, was a performance installation consisting of a suspended block of melting ice with 273 red seeds frozen in it, 273 for each day I'd been a mother at that point. The seeds are from the sandalwood tree and have long been a symbol of love in China. They are called xiangxi dou in Mandarin, which translates as seeds of love longing. In Singapore and Malaysia, we call them love seeds, and lovers gather them to give to each other. As the ice melts, the red seeds fall to the ground. Hooked up to breast pumps, I recited excerpts gleaned from literature through the ages on breastfeeding, from the most idealized of aphorisms through to the starkest complexities of the lived experience. All the while, milk spilled from my breasts, turning crimson at my feet. I began with quotes like, "A baby nursing at a mother's breast is an undeniable affirmation of our rootedness in nature," and "It is only in the act of nursing that a mother realizes her motherhood in visible and tangible fashion. It is a joy of every moment," and other idealized aphorisms penned mostly by men, what a surprise. Ending 30 minutes later with this Mary McCarthy excerpt, Pris gritted her teeth. The baby's mouth always hurt her nipple like a bite. Her breasts were very sensitive, and she hated to have Sloane touch them in lovemaking. She had hoped that nursing the baby would get her over that. People said that nursing was very satisfying sensually to the mother, and she had thought that if she got in the habit with the baby, she would not mind so much with a grown man. Though she had not told Sloane, this was one of her principal reasons for agreeing to breastfeed Stephen, so that she could give Sloane, who was entitled to it, more fun in bed. But so far, nursing, like most of sex, was an ordeal she had to steel herself for each time it happened, by using all her willpower and thinking about love and self-sacrifice. The renowned pediatrician DonaldWhitaker wrote in 1947, "Let me give some reasons why a mother hates her baby. The baby is ruthless, treats her as scum, an unpaid servant, a slave. He dominates. Life must unfold at the baby's rate, and she has to love him, excretions and all. He is suspicious, refuses her good food, and makes her doubt herself, but eats very well with his aunt. After an awful morning with him, she goes out, and he smiles at a stranger, who says, 'Isn't he sweet?'" And the poet Adrian Rich wrote, "My children cause me the most exquisite suffering of which I have any experience. It is the suffering of ambivalence, the murderous alteration between bitter resentment and raw-edged nerves and blissful gratification." In this next work, Baraka, I delivered an academic paper by Leah Morand and Jacob Gilad, entitled "From Folklore to Scientific Evidence, Breastfeeding and Wet Nursing in Islam and the Case of Non-Puerperal Lactation." The paper explored folklore associated with breastfeeding, its historical, religious, and folkloristic aspects, wet nursing, milk kin, and accounts of lactation by non-pregnant women documented in various societies and religions throughout centuries. They suggested that currently known medical conditions explain this phenomenon, elucidating the origin, anthropology, and evolvement of ancient myth and superstition. The audiences discerned a second veiled activity from the rhythmic drone of a pump and my oddly shaped chest. When I finished delivering the paper, I decanted breast milk expressed during the recitation into porcelain spoons. I then spoon-fed the audience, one person at a time, pairing the theory surrounding lactation with lactation in practice. And this last work I'll present is entitled Panacea. It's a durational one-to-one performance. I was hooked up to a breast pump so that I was expressing milk throughout the 4 hours of the performance. Visitors joined me one at a time and received a shot of breast milk in exchange for a confession. So through the arduous process of nightly broken sleep, sterilizing everything each time I pumped, whilst traveling to town every couple of days, I was expressing approximately 2.5 liters of milk a day. In cities with local milk-sharing networks, I was able to give it away to babies who needed it. But I also performed in smaller towns that did not have such networks. That's when I discovered that there is a booming online market for human breast milk. Going at £1.60 per fluid ounce, it is dubbed liquid gold and sought after not only by mothers who can't make milk for their babies, but also by athletes and by the infirm. Breast milk contains immunologic agents that fight viruses and parasites. It is sterile and antibacterial, so it helps heal wounds. Some hospitals give it to patients to ingest and to use topically for post-surgical healing. Chemo patients and organ transplant patients are offered breast milk to fight infections and strengthen their immune systems. Some nursing homes engage wet nurses to supply breast milk for the chronically ill who can no longer take solid food. I also came across many pro-breast milk sites proclaiming it to be a panacea for all ailments imaginable. So thinking about the quasi-magical qualities attributed to breast milk, I decided to invite participants to join me one at a time in an intimate space to share something they felt ashamed of or regretful about. Then, in exchange for their confession, I offered them a shot of freshly squeezed boob juice. And to preempt any health and safety concerns you might have regarding the sharing of bodily fluids, I was and am free from transmissible infections, so no one was harmed by my milk. So that's the end of my presentation. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you so much, everybody, for these revealing and fascinating ideas, concepts, revelations, discussions of your work. So now I think we'll turn to some general questions that we can all answer and address together. And then we also have some audience questions after that. First of all, perhaps just a very broad general question on the responses that you've had to your work. And I'm thinking about kind of public responses, perhaps especially Lynn, you might have the most to say on that, kind of public responses to your work, because you're taking your work out into spaces where people might not know what they're going to come across or what to expect. But also, what about professional responses from people who you work with in academia? But also personal responses. What do your friends and family members say, especially when you're kind of revealing things about yourself, your personal life? So what kind of responses have you all had to your work?
I'll go first. There actually hasn't been much response to this body of work outside of recent investigations and initiatives led by women artists and academics. When I performed these works live at the Perth Institute of Contemporary Art in Australia and this festival in Canada, Art Nomad, in 2013, the works were met with deadly silence. A couple of years later, I showed documentation of these works in an online presentation called Mothers Are Making Art, organized by the Procreate Project and the Museum of Motherhood. And then a few months ago, Dr. Lena Simic and Dr. Emily Underwood-Lee interviewed me about these works for their research project on maternal performance. And now this panel is about all the attention that these works have received. My friends were mortified by these works, mostly because they were worried about me and my child, that we would survive each other. And some friends who were trying hard to conceive or going through IVF at the time were saddened and upset for all the reasons you can well imagine. And as for my traditional Chinese family, they never want to know anything about my boobs in public, so no response from them whatsoever.
Wow, well that seems so different from the images that you shared, because you had an audience on many of those images that looked so enraptured by your performance. They looked so willing to take part in what you were doing. And
they were willing, but there was no feedback after ingesting my milk.
I guess I will say I also have not had much feedback on that kind of work either. I think that when I've been on sort of academic job interviews and it has come up that it's sort of talked about for a minute and then subject has kind of changed to other things that I've worked on. But I also feel like it's so important and central to the work that I do. In my novel that's coming out this fall, one of the kind of it's about the first natural born set of quintuplets in the world who were born in Canada during the 30s, and it's historical fiction based on that. And so they were taken by the government, and actually became the king of England became their legal guardians, actually. And so one of the things that sort of ends up being a key point for me in that novel is the rejection of the act of breastfeeding, that when the mother kind of is not able to breastfeed the quintuplets, that for her that becomes a rejection of the babies themselves, like not being able to do that with her body. And I feel like that sort of, for me, that process of breastfeeding, going through breastfeeding, was really important in being able to write that in terms of fiction, and being able to think about the ways that that was really important as a bonding moment between myself and my child. And to echo Anne-Marie's point, I don't think that, there's lots of other ways to bond with your child, right? That breastfeeding is not certainly the only route to bonding with your child. But I imagine sort of if there were 5 children that you needed to create a bond with, that would be right away a sort of quickly alienating factor to not even be able to connect with them in that way.
For me, in my personal life, friends and family, I think we're probably relieved that I was channeling my love of talking about boobs and breastfeeding into academic work, so they didn't have to hear about it quite as much. There was a time when I was, adjuncting, waiting to start my first tenure track job, that I was training to become a La Leche League leader, and I was hosting La Leche League meetings at my house. And I think everybody was just kind of tired of hearing me talk about boobs and breastfeeding. But in my professional life, interestingly, motherhood studies is not my primary gig. I was hired to teach global Anglophone literature. My dissertation research is not on motherhood studies. Tangentially, it is related to, gender issues that I deal with in my work, but this was definitely sort of a side pet project. And I think that a lot of people see it that way, and perhaps it gets marginalized because the subject matter doesn't really have a really established place in, kind of real research. Teaching at a small women's college, I think, has allowed me to focus more on this, and it's become more my primary area of research or passion. And I'm grateful to work in an environment where I can do that, because I'm not being pushed as hard to research in the area that I was hired to teach. And so I am grateful for that opportunity. I'm grateful that in a college that is so interested in gender, there's been more of a space for it professionally.
I wonder whether part of the reason that, especially perhaps Dionne, the response that you've had, that you say at interviews or in conversations about your research, it's something which is quickly pushed aside. Part of that, might it be something to do with the fact that it is something that we feel that we have to talk about so personally? Does it feel like, is it part of that, or am I just being too generous, too kind to the people who push this aside, in that they think it's private and personal and they don't necessarily want to force you to talk about it in those private ways? What does everybody think? Do you feel compelled, like I do, to explain your own breastfeeding stories when you start to tell people about your professional work?
I mean, I think personally, sort of, maybe that's even a larger question in terms of like thinking about sort of the male gaze in academia. And I think Anne-Marie spoke well to that, right? That, I think like a women's college is an amazing place where that is absolutely supported in terms of research. But I don't think we should, assume that somehow, the world at large would like to talk about and think about breastfeeding, even though it is something that is so important in terms of all of us existing on this planet as human beings, right? That I think that part of that is, well, those are women's issues, but it's not, right? I mean, when it's connected to issues of mortality, infant mortality, and health and wellness, right? To me, that's not a women's issue, even though I feel like that is often sort of the box that it is put in, you know. And I was so excited with Anne Marie's book that, you know, that there was a feminist press that was picking it up, and I thought that was a really important, an important press to put it out. But, you know, I also hope that, like, we can have a wider conversation about breastfeeding, you know, and thinking about those who are breastfeeding as well, who are non-binary, who are trans, right? And thinking about all the different ways that breastfeeding looks in our contemporary culture, because there's not just, right, a monolithic vision of who should be talking about breastfeeding, who should be thinking about breastfeeding, and who is breastfeeding.
That's really interesting. We've actually had a question from one of the audience members who's a writer and artist, Maud Lannon, and she has asked about this very thing and asked how to make this discomfort that people seem to feel about talking about breastfeeding generative. And she asks, I wonder if breastfeeding can transcend beyond maternal research and cisgenderism if led by cis women. Are there other ways that we can make it more obvious to people that it's not such a straightforward thing that people imagine, that only a woman who's given birth, a cisgender woman who's given birth, can breastfeed? I mean, I don't think many people know about things like relactation and the fact that adoptive parents can, you know, take special kinds of treatments to allow them to breastfeed. Is that the kind of thing, that kind of step into technology or medicine that we can talk about or should talk about to make this debate a wider one?
I mean, interestingly, I think this comes down to making the academy less cisgendered, male, white, heterosexual, right? That if cis men got pregnant and lactated and went through menopause, you know, all of those topics would be less taboo, and we would have more information at our disposal. It would be demystified in a way that would put this kind of research at the center of everyone's agenda. But because, you know, like so many things pertaining to the othered bodies, women's bodies, the bodies of racialized others, it's not been focused on.
Perhaps we'll move on to another kind of big question then, because we've talked a little bit about some of the aims of each of your work. And Lynn, I was really interested in that confession idea of giving a confession in exchange for a shot of breast milk. And I wondered how you came to kind of create that idea and how you came to connect the connection with the breast milk. But perhaps more broadly, a question to you and then to everyone else as well. If there was one thing that you wanted to achieve with your work, if it had one aim, what would that be?
Right. So, I mean, yeah, my experience of becoming a mother was very different from what I felt I was sold by mainstream media and by a lot of women in my life. You know, my sister had 4 children, didn't tell me any of the horrible parts. You know, for her it was like this most magical experience and blah blah blah, and I felt a lot of shame surrounding the experience that I had. I felt like a failure, you know, that I felt like even though my body had evolved to do exactly that, to birth and to make milk, you know, I couldn't do it. You know, I couldn't do it. It was so painful and so difficult. And then I thought, I can't be the only one having this experience. It's not possible, you know, that I'm the only one. So I would like for other women who had or are having horrible experiences of early motherhood to know that they're not alone, nor are they freaks and monsters. There is more than that one glowing narrative surrounding motherhood, that it's so instinctive and so fulfilling. And there's no shame in finding the experience terrifying or awful. There are as many maternal experiences as there are women, and they're all legitimate.
Well, I would say, I guess, sort of my aim is just for us to have more open discussions about breastfeeding, to take them away from conversations that are somehow marginalized to cisgendered women, and thinking about sort of opening up a broader conversation. One of the things I talk about too in my essays, that I think there has been a pretty sort of long established culture for, you know, white women to talking about, and white cisgendered women specifically talking about breastfeeding. And I think that not that those conversations haven't been going on in other communities, but I think they have been quieter or laced up with different kinds of shame or misconceptions surrounding breastfeeding. And so I think opening up that conversation so that it is more inclusive and a wider conversation, you know, and I think, you know, cisgendered men talking about breastfeeding is extremely important as well. You know, for me, my husband was very important on in thinking about making sure that conditions were as optimal as they could be for me to be able to breastfeed our child in the way that I wanted to. And so I think just opening up that conversation is what's more important. I think as we tell and share stories about our own experiences with it, that is a way to sort of think about, and we hear from more different types of people who are breastfeeding, that is a way to make the conversation larger and to make the conversation more inclusive.
Yeah, along very similar lines, I think that it's really problematic to pressure women to breastfeed when we don't have the policies that support what it really takes to do that. And when the work is relegated to the person with the breasts, and it's not viewed as a more communal project. And so I hope that normalizing the conversation pushes us to a place eventually where policy follows suit. You know, as a humanities person, I always, you know, I feel like the humanities are the starting point for changing the world. It focuses on the human aspect of any, you know, any issue that we face, and we hope that it trickles down into the policy. And so, yeah, the reason I said I moved away from thinking that this work had to be sort of position itself as breastfeeding advocacy is because we're just not at a place where we support what we're pressuring women to do.
I think all of those comments answer one question that we've had from the audience. Alison Lloyd has asked whether it's natural to take easily to breastfeeding, and I think we've all addressed in a number of ways how it isn't natural for many people, or even if it is natural, the socioeconomic systems in place to support women prevent it from being undertaken naturally in many cases. I think that's a big question that she's asking, and hopefully she's found lots of responses to that. And maybe it's natural for some people, Lynn, like your sister, who expressed how natural it was for her, and for others it either isn't or things prevent it from being possible. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I think we've come to the end of the time that we have allotted, so I think we'll probably have to leave the conversation there. I'm really looking forward to reading your book, Dionne. I can't wait to have that when it's out. And thank you so much. I think there's been so much to think about. We've had loads of lovely comments in the chat, and I think this is going to be a wonderful resource for people to come back to as well. Thank you so much, Dionne, Lynn, and Anne-Marie, for sharing your ideas and sharing your work so openly, for sharing your personal experiences, and thanks to everybody here for joining us as well.